Good afternoon. I'm Jen White, host of 1A. It's produced at WAMU in Washington, D.C., and distributed to public radio stations across the country by NPR. Now, we all know there are three traditional branches of government: the legislative, the judicial, and the executive. But the fourth estate, the free press, is another backbone of our democratic republic. However, in recent months, we've seen a rise in defamation lawsuits, denials of access to the halls of power, funding threats to public media, and this is all happening against the backdrop of an ever-changing news ecosystem in which we're able to create media bubbles. Information is more difficult to vet, and algorithms drive us further from the truth, yes, and further from one another. So what should we understand about these threats to the fourth estate and what it means for our democracy? And does history hold lessons for us as we chart a path forward? With me on stage to tackle these questions is Julie Pace. She's the executive editor and senior vice president at the Associated Press. Jonah Goldberg, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also the co-founder and editor-in-chief at the Dispatch. And Samantha Barbas. She's a professor at the University of Iowa College of Law. So I just want to briefly start with a quick round-robin question for each of you. What is the value of an independent press, Julie?
Oh my gosh, I could go on at length about the value of an independent press. Look, the independent press is there to hold powerful interests accountable and really to be there to do that on behalf of the public, not for themselves, not for their own businesses, but really to be the eyes and ears for the public. And I believe strongly in that.
Jonah?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would only add that free societies, successful societies, liberal societies in the classical liberal sense, they thrive on disagreement, not on agreement. And I think unity is one of the most overrated concepts in modern American life. What democracy is about is disagreement, not agreement. And the press is essential in that understanding of how you get to best outcomes is by having a vigorous and robust argument that is based on facts, and based on reason, and based on different, perfectly legitimate perspectives. And that doesn't mean I have to like everything the press does, but you want a free press because that is one of the fundamental guarantors of a decent society and a free society.
Samantha, I'd love your answer to that question as well, but also as it relates to individual free speech. So independent press, yes, but how does that connect to our ability to speak freely?
Yeah, so I'm reminded of the words of Justice Brennan, who wrote the landmark opinion in the 1964 Supreme Court case, New York Times versus Sullivan. And he described the central meaning of the First Amendment as being the ability of the press and citizens to monitor government, to hold officials accountable, to check abuses of authority. And the central purpose of the press is to circulate the information to the public that it needs to monitor government and to have productive discussions about issues that matter and to make good choices as citizens of a democratic society.
So with that framing, Samantha, how would you characterize this moment in the country for our independent press?
Yeah, I believe that President Trump is waging war on the press. And historically, this is unprecedented. We've seen presidents in the past criticize the press. We've seen them threaten to sue the press, and they've sued the press. But never before have we seen the kind of multifaceted, total, multidimensional attack on the press of the kind that is being waged by Trump and his allies. Rhetorically, President Trump has attacked journalists on thousands of occasions as criminals and enemies of the people, with the intent of discrediting the press and getting the public to not believe the things that are being reported about him. And he's backed up these rhetorical attacks with legal attacks. He has threatened to pull the funding of NPR and PBS. He has threatened to prosecute journalists and leakers. And the FCC is investigating all of the major broadcasters with the exception of Fox, with the intention of finding some sort of violation of FCC regulations that would be grounds for revoking their broadcast licenses. He has brought libel suits against the major media outlets, largely unmeritorious, with the purpose of harassing and intimidating. There are also lawsuits for consumer fraud, a novel legal theory that I could talk about at length. And he's also attacking New York Times versus Sullivan, that landmark protection for freedom of the press.
And I want to talk a little bit more about that later, but I first want to, Jonah, acknowledge the media ecosystem we exist in right now. It looks dramatically different than it did even 10 years ago. How does social media fit into this discussion?
Sure, and we'll have a little disagreement offline about whether or not Woodrow Wilson was worse to the press than Donald Trump is, but I'm perfectly willing to concede Donald Trump is very bad about the press. Journalists love to argue about journalism and the craft of journalism and all these kinds of things, and about politics and all that. But I think the material culture, the technology of social media and of the internet in general has been profoundly transformative, mostly for the negative, for the media landscape. The internet basically destroyed most two newspaper towns, and two newspaper towns were what kept the newspaper business going. But social media in particular, at the Dispatch, one of the things we try to inculcate in our young writers is that following Twitter or social media isn't really journalism. There is this tendency to say, oh my gosh, look, someone said something wrong on the internet, and think that that's a news story. And the problem with social media is, as we put it, it's an attempt to monetize dopamine hits, right? It is an attempt to sort of make people crazy through negative engagement. And the problem is that it works. And so I was never that big a Marshall McLuhan fan, but I think he was right. And sometimes the medium is the message. And social media is transforming people, rewiring people's brains. I'm friends with Jonathan Haidt. He told you that story better than I can. But it's definitely true. I mean, you look at what's happened to poor Senator Mike Lee. He's got Twitter poisoning like you wouldn't believe. I feel like I want to put the old Mike Lee on a milk box and say what happened to him. But the fundamental problem I think that we have these days is we talk a lot about the lack of faith and trust in institutions and all of that kind of thing. One way to think about it is we see the decline in the role of editing. And what I mean by that is not just in the journalistic sense, I mean it in the institutional sense. What do editors do? Well, they get raw copy from very passionate young reporters, and they say, hey, you don't have all the facts here. Go back and get them. Have you talked to this guy who disagrees with you? Go get that quote, right? Rework this. This is too overheated. This isn't responsible. That's the editorial function in science, right? Where you have people who look at your data and say you need more data or whatever. That's the editorial function for schools. That's what institutions do, is they are kind of circuit breakers for passion. And we live in a time where social media and other technologies allow us to work around that editorial function throughout our lives, and we can jump straight into the bloodstream with stupid ideas, with dangerous ideas, with lies, and we get to sort of be performative rather than responsible. And I think the mainstream media is really struggling with how to deal with that. And part because the audience itself is being trained to want that. And audience capture in the mainstream media is a huge problem.
Well, I see Julie nodding, and I want to get your response to what we heard there from Jonah.
Sure. Well, look, I fundamentally agree with some of the challenges that social media and kind of the changes in the media landscape present to more institutional and sort of mainstream media. And I do think that it's incumbent on us as mainstream organizations. I work for an organization that's been around for 179 years. We're about as mainstream and kind of traditional as it comes. And so we talk a lot about, how do we ensure that we are explaining our value to audiences, because there is so much value in the work, that Jonah's talking about, the editorial process, the fact-checking process, the discussion about selecting stories. It's not random. It's not something that just kind of poof, comes together. And, while I would never probably actually put a camera on our daily editorial meetings, sometimes I want to, because I want people to see, just how much care and thought goes into the decisions that we make, that, if you're sitting there sort of attacking us or anybody else as the liberal media or having an agenda, if you actually saw the work that goes into the product, I think you would come away with a very different impression. And so one of the things we are talking about quite a bit is, how do we bring more transparency to that process? How do we pull back the curtain on the types of debate that happened internally? How do we pull back the curtain on the way that we hold ourselves accountable internally before we put anything out externally? And how do we hold ourselves accountable when we do? It's a human enterprise. We are going to make mistakes. How do we make sure that we're transparent and accountable when we do put something out that doesn't always live up to our standards and values?
Well, that leads very neatly to my next question, because President Trump has targeted the Associated Press since earlier this year, when he renamed the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America via executive order. And the AP decided not to use that name. And we should note that many news organizations follow AP's standards, including my program 1A. So first, explain why the AP decided not to use Gulf of America.
Sure. So we're a global news organization. Every day, about 4 billion people around the world will interact with AP journalism. You might not always know it, but you are very likely to interact with a photo, a piece of text, audio, video from the AP. Because we're a global news organization, the style guidance that we issue has to be based on what is most understandable to the largest number of people. And that was the decision-making process that we went through. What was the language that we were going to use that would be most widely understood? And so our style guidance, which is quite nuanced, if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to actually read it. It says that we will continue to use the Gulf of Mexico, but we will also acknowledge when it makes sense that the president used an executive order to rename the Gulf of America within the boundaries of the United States. That guidance sat out there for several weeks. Other news organizations have followed it and continue to follow it. But because that guidance went against what the president had issued in his executive order, we were blocked from being part of the presidential pool, which we've been a part of since its founding. We were pressured to reverse course. We obviously did not do that because we are independent. We are not there to serve as the mouthpiece for any government, any administration in the United States and any government around the world. And one of the things that we talked about a lot as we were making that decision, and also as we lived in that time period after we were blocked, is, this is not the first government that has asked us to change our language, that has asked us to change style guidance. We operate in places like China, in Russia, in Myanmar, in Iran. Name a country around the world, we are probably there. If we backed off in this situation in a country where the First Amendment exists, where press freedom is guaranteed in the Constitution, what would that mean for our journalists and our teams in places where it doesn't exist?
Now, you sued over that ban. Where does that stand, and what has this meant for your coverage of the White House?
Sure. So we were really gratified that we won our lawsuit. A Trump-appointed judge, Judge McFadden, in the District of Columbia, ruled in favor of the AP. And again, if you're looking for reading material, I would really encourage you to read Judge McFadden's order, because it is a really robust defense of the First Amendment and the role of an independent press. And to the first question you had asked about, it's not just a defense of again, institutions of the press, it's a defense of the public's right to free speech. And I think that's really important here. So we won that lawsuit. The government has appealed. We're in the appeals process right now, but it has not stopped our ability to cover the White House. I'm just incredibly proud of our teams and the way that they have continued to show up every single day, do their jobs, not make a thing out of this. We're not trying to pick a fight here. We're just trying to do our jobs, cover the White House, and do it in an independent and fact-based way.
Samantha, I want to turn back to New York Times v. Sullivan. You referred to it earlier. Briefly explain the precedent set in that 1964 decision.
Yeah, New York Times versus Sullivan is a Supreme Court decision from 1964 that gives the press and all speakers really extraordinary protections in libel cases involving public officials and public figures. And I want to say maybe just a little bit about the history of New York Times versus Sullivan, because it underscores why it is so important today. So New York Times versus Sullivan dates back to the early years of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s, when segregationists were looking for a way to shut down the civil rights movement and the news media that were reporting favorably about the civil rights movement. And they arrived on libel law as a weapon because libel laws were incredibly strict at the time. If a publisher made a single error of fact and they could not completely prove the truth of their statements, they could be held liable for defamation. There was no leniency for an innocent mistake of fact. And so the segregationists brought libel suits against the major media outlets. They sued the New York Times, they sued CBS, and they were winning. New York Times would have been bankrupted if the Supreme Court had not stepped in and issued this ruling, which again says that public officials and public figures who are bringing libel cases have to show that the statement in question was false and made with actual malice or reckless disregard of the truth. And that is a very high bar to clear. It has protected the press very well over the past 60 years. It's enabled a lot of critically important reporting, and New York Times versus Sullivan is under attack right now.
Two justices, Neil Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas, indicated they're willing to revisit that decision.
Yeah, there have been a number of efforts by various groups to get a test case before the Supreme Court that would invite it to overrule Sullivan and related cases, and we know that Thomas and Gorsuch would potentially vote to overrule some of these related cases. Thomas on the grounds that New York Times versus Sullivan cannot be justified by an originalist reading of the First Amendment. And Gorsuch has offered a number of different views on this, but one thing he stated is that the media have abused the privilege of New York Times versus Sullivan, that they are not reporting facts correctly, that they're defaming people with impunity, and therefore they no longer deserve this shield that was given to them in 1964.
So as two working journalists, I'd love to hear your responses. Jonah?
I don't personally think New York Times v. Sullivan is sacrosanct. And it's funny. I mean, look, one of the things that Donald Trump benefited from enormously is very generous free speech laws so that he couldn't be charged with incitement on January 6th, right? And his ingratitude towards generous free speech interpretations and First Amendment interpretations is kind of one of the weird ironies of all of this. At the same time, I'm not sure anything that would replace New York Times v. Sullivan would be better. So in an abundance of caution, I'd rather keep it where it is. But the only reason I bring it up with Trump is that I think one of the problems we have with sort of free speech discourse generally in this country, and journalistic discourse in this country, is that in this sort of weird, red versus blue, stupidity that, we all have to endure, very few people in the partisan fights actually want their own standards applied to them. They just want to weaponize the standard against their opponents. And so, take cancel culture. The left has had a real problem with cancel culture for the last decade or so. You know who else has? The right. Because America has a problem with cancel culture. America, I spent my entire life. My dad was a journalist, and his favorite hobby was complaining about the New York Times. Like it is what gave him true joy. The fact that the New York Times refused to stop calling Fidel Castro Dr. Castro drove him crazy. And Fidel Castro had a law degree, but they would call him Dr. Castro. It drove my dad crazy, right? I love doing liberal media bias criticism and all of that kind of stuff. The problem that we have now is that a lot of my friends on the right want to make criticism of liberal media bias the permission structure to do whatever they want, and they have 0.0 interest in, say, Fox News' bias. Never mind some of the weird poltroons and gibbons from this fever swampy sort of Steve Bannon world who have White House press credentials now. They don't care that those guys are just propagandists, but if the AP gets a comma wrong, they're like, this is an outrage, right? And so my point is like, I'm for a vigorous discussion about what free speech standards should be, but I don't want to hear from people who only want those standards applied to their political opponents. If it's not binding to you, then why are you even in the conversation?
Julie?
Well, and this is one of the things we were talking about a lot with our peer organizations when we were moving forward with our lawsuit, because look, suing the White House was not something that we were really excited to do. This was not a very comfortable position for an organization like the AP, which really prides itself on being nonpartisan and reaching an audience across the political spectrum. But one of the things we talked about with peer organizations was, if the White House can do this to us over this phrase that they don't like, what will happen if the next administration comes in and asks you to say something that you want to stand by because it meets your standards and values?
It's sort of like Harvard. If Harvard wasn't going to fight what the administration was doing, who would?
Who would? Who would? And that's what we felt. We felt we had to take this stand because we were doing this not on our behalf, but really on behalf of everyone. And to get back to New York Times versus Sullivan, I mean, I'm sure this will come as no surprise that I fundamentally disagree with the notion that the press is sort of sitting there saying, whew, since we've got this protection in place, let's just go out and libel everybody here, right? I think that there's been this conflating, and this gets to some of Jonah's point, there's become this conflating between reporting that people don't like and don't agree with and reporting that is actually inaccurate. There's this blending of the two, and so much so that I think it can become really difficult for the public to ascertain the difference between the two. Is that actually inaccurate, or does somebody just disagree with it? And the amplification, particularly on social media, of the viewpoints that you tend to agree with, I think makes it even harder for the public to separate those two.
Samantha, when we look across history, are there certain lessons we should take from other times when the independent press has been under attack, especially by the White House?
Yeah, I think one thing that history teaches us is that in moments of crisis, political crisis, times of political polarization or moral crisis, freedom of speech and press are often one of the first casualties. And we saw that, for example, in the First World War era, when the government cracked down fiercely on even mild criticism of the government's war policy. We saw that in the McCarthy period, right, when any speech that was deemed to be too liberal was tagged with the label communist and subjected to severe punishment. And there was no question that democracy was undermined during these periods, and the advancement of learning was deterred. But I also think there were some unexpected benefits to come out of these free speech crises, namely that we get really big free speech advances after them. For example, it was after the World War I period that the Supreme Court first began to interpret the First Amendment in a way that was more expansive and protective of dissent. And similarly, after the McCarthy period, we really get the beginning of our modern free speech jurisprudence, right, with the Supreme Court protecting all manner of expression and protest. So I'm optimistic. I think we're in a crisis of free speech right now, but I think that we can potentially take the lessons that we're learning and the conversations that we're having and ultimately emerge from this with a stronger and more robust commitment to freedom of speech and a deeper understanding of what free speech should mean.
Jonah, I'm curious to hear whether you're optimistic as well, considering how different the media ecosystem is today and the fact that so many communities across the country, you alluded to it earlier, have lost those local voices that helped us have a shared conversation, not about what was happening at the national level, but what was happening in our own communities.
Yeah, so, as we know, there's a cliche among journalists that 3 examples equals a trend. You can make an argument that you can find 3 examples that says the popular culture is total garbage, and you can find 3 examples that says we're in this renaissance of family values because it's a rich, vibrant thing, and there are going to be contradictory trends in it. Similarly, there are a lot of great things that are happening in journalism, and there are a lot of terrible things. Right now on net, I think the terrible things outweigh the positive things. The decline of local journalism is a real problem. I mean, one of the things my friend Chris Starwalt likes to point out is that one of the first things that happens when a small town or small city loses its local newspaper is their bond rate goes up, because it becomes more difficult for lenders to actually get visibility into whether or not the government is well run in that town, whether it's corrupt or not. There were real practical, real-world problems with the decline of local journalism that, at the same time, there are a bunch of places that are recognizing this, and they are trying to come up with, in an entrepreneurial way, there are lots of great local newsletters and that kind of stuff that harkens back to an earlier time in American journalism. One of the reasons why Steve Hayes and I started the Dispatch is we wanted to model behavior that we thought was lacking, not just in journalism, but particularly on the political right. And we're very proud of what we've done. But I kind of agree with your point, is that sometimes, I made this point on yesterday's panel, is that sometimes things have to get worse so they can get better. And people need to learn from bad mistakes and then try to counteract them. And I still think this is a fundamentally good and decent country. And this is a country that most people want to be informed. And we are a very entrepreneurial spirit, so we're going to figure out ways to do that. But in the meantime, a lot of bad trends are going on.
Yeah. Julie?
Oh, man. Look, I'm an optimist by nature. And I agree there are some really cool and innovative and exciting things that are happening in the media space, particularly at the local level to fill the void. I think one of the things that I worry about is the ways in which kind of individuals are choosing to not engage with fact-based sources of information that don't already align with what they believe. Because it's so easy to do
Confirmation bias.
It is so easy to do that. And that happens on the right and it happens on the left. And it happens with, highly educated people who may sit in a room like this and want to hear about the importance of the free press and then may go back to looking at news sources that only confirm what they already believe. And it's a hard thing to do. You have to actively choose to not do that. You have to make yourself uncomfortable. You have to blow past the algorithms that are pushing things toward you that confirm what you believe. It is a hard thing to do, but over and over and over again, we see that individuals are not taking that path. And that does make me worried because all of the technological systems around us are going to only embolden that first easy path. And so we can have all of these, green shoots that are sprouting up of creativity and independence, but we need people to want to engage with them and want to support them.
So how is the AP trying to rise to the moment?
So a couple of things that we're doing. Look, we are really the only organization at our scale that is still on the ground in all 50 states in the US. And I can tell you that is not a great business decision. There's not a lot of revenue that you can generate from having that, but we believe so deeply in that because if we're not there, increasingly who is? So one of the things that we've done over the last year as we have started a sister organization, the AP Fund for Journalism, which is a nonprofit organization to try to help raise funds to put more investment into state and local news, because we think this is really vitally important. And the traditional business models that existed to support that type of work just are no longer there. So we've had to really make a conscious choice that we're gonna stay in that space and we're gonna try to make investments there. We just have to go about it in a different way. The other thing I would note though is, if you look beyond the United States, there are many other countries in the world where we are on the ground and one of the very few news organizations there when it's not very easy to be there. I mentioned some of them before. And so we're committed to this, not just in the United States, but really globally, being on the ground, bearing witness to things that are happening and reporting out in a fact-based way.
And do you think even beyond your presence as a reporting organization, there are broader ripple effects you're concerned about, just the safety of the press in other countries, right? You may carry a certain level of protection because you are a U.S. organization, but if you're a reporter from that country, the standard the AP sets may also extend a certain level of protection.
And we talk about this a lot because one of the things that we really, over the last 10 to 15 years, have really prioritized is in countries around the world, ensuring that the bulk of our staff is from those countries. We think it makes the reporting better, adds more nuance, more context, more diversity to our report. But it creates a challenge. If you have staff on the ground in a country where press freedom is under attack and they are a Westerner, one of the worst things that's going to happen to them, yes, detention is always a risk, they're likely to just get kicked out of the country. If you're from that country, there's a real risk to the staff, to their families, to the overall operations there, and that is a risk we carry in countless places around the world. So there's a ton of work that goes on behind the scenes. If you see a story from the AP out of Iran or China or Russia, there's a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes to ensure that we can do that safely. But, we think there is such value in being there. There's such value in having that on the ground presence. Because again, if we're not there, increasingly, there are very few others that will be.
Samantha, you shared with us some other times in U.S. history when the independent press has come under attack and what we saw on the other side of that. But I'm curious whether you think these periods in our history are actually necessary, because they force us to have conversations about the First Amendment. They force us not to fall into complacency. So this time is maybe a necessary level set for our thoughts about the First Amendment and our willingness to stand up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm just thinking about the McCarthy period, which I believe was a moment of crisis in freedom of speech and press that has some parallels with the present situation that we're in. And I think that, again, it was because of the McCarthy period that we end up getting what I call a culture of free speech in the 1960s, right? Where the public kind of had to stand back and look at the destruction and devastation that was wreaked by McCarthy and to kind of recommit to the value of embracing dissent and freedom of expression. One other thing I'm struck by when I think about the McCarthy period is how the devastation of that period wasn't just a function of the government suppressing speech. It was also because those repressions were reinforced by the private sector. So it wasn't just that people were being hauled before the House Un-American Activities Committee, it was that people were losing their jobs because they were suspected of being communists. They were being ostracized by their communities. They were losing their reputations. So I think freedom of speech isn't just about protection from government punishment of speech. It's also a matter of culture. I think it's a cultural value, and therefore it's something that we can all work to protect in our daily lives. When we choose to exercise toleration, or when we choose to have an open mind and listen to perspectives that may not be the ones that we're used to hearing, right? And so I think, to your question, yes, these moments of crisis really force us to reevaluate what is this freedom of speech that really should be at the heart of our American tradition. And again, I'm optimistic that we can move forward.
Before we go to audience questions, I love ending sessions like this rather than hearing an answer from each of you, hearing a question that you'd like people to ask themselves as they reflect on this conversation, and especially as it relates to the value of an independent press, how it relates to individual free speech protections, and how each American is responsible for upholding the principles enshrined in the First Amendment. So Jonah, I'll come to you first. A question you want us to ask ourselves, perhaps even our community.
Interesting. So I've long held the view that journalism is an American right, not just a right for, we all have the right to commit journalism, right? And it's not for a guild, and it's not for people with a license. Everybody has the right to commit journalism. And the question is, how much are you, in the way that you are sort of, particularly now that basically everyone has their own printing press when it comes to social media, how much are you actually employing the standards that you think professional journalists are supposed to apply? Are you making sure that what you're doing is factually correct? Are you giving the other side a fair hearing? And moreover, as consumers, I think it's really important to realize that if all the media you're consuming confirms what you already believe, you're doing it wrong. We have a rule at Dispatch that if we don't piss off a third of our readers on any given day, we're doing something wrong. You should be an engaged citizen, and you ask yourself, I got to put this is like Jeopardy, I got to put this in the form of a question. As an engaged citizen, are you doing any due diligence to find out whether your priors might be wrong and that you are actually addicted to news outlets that only tell you what you already want to know?
Julie.
Yeah, I would amplify that. Yes, and ask yourself, what are you as an individual doing? If you believe in free speech and you believe in an independent press, what are you as an individual doing to support that? And can you point to any moments where you have supported that, even if you disagree with the perspective that is protected by the First Amendment and disagree with an outlet or a journalist who is covering something under the protections of the First Amendment? Really, challenge yourself to think about the last time that you really did that. And I think, sometimes you'd be surprised by the answer.
Samantha.
Yeah, I think the question that I've been thinking a lot about lately and that I know legal scholars have been grappling with is, what does freedom of speech look like today in our social media age? A lot of the law of freedom of speech, constitutional law of freedom of speech, was really created in the 1960s and 70s when the media landscape, the speech environment was so different. And we have to ask ourselves the question, are we going to retain those laws and principles, or are we going to try to update them or think about them differently in a world where communication is revolutionized? And the potential for free speech has expanded tremendously, and with that, the potential for harm and serious injury. And how are we going to balance those interests, right? The right to be free of injury and the right to protect freedom of speech.
All compelling questions. Let's take your questions now. We have a microphone. Let's start down here, and then we'll come to you. Over here? Mm-hmm. Yes, please stand.
Thank you. We've had a robust conversation about speaking and listening. And I'm wondering if listening is the superpower. And I'd love to know what you've learned about listening.
Great question.
That's a great question. Well, look, you're absolutely right. I think, as a journalist, this is not the most revelatory, bit of guidance, but one of the things we talk a lot about with our reporters is that, if you go into an interview, you're doing all the talking, again, talk about doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong, right? Some of the most revelatory interviews that I've ever done with presidents or, individuals, I barely said anything, right? I just kind of sat back, have prompts, you ask a couple questions and you let people talk. And to have that be successful, though, you really need to listen. You really need to understand what people are telling you. That's from a reporting standpoint. I think about this also from an audience standpoint. We are engaging more than ever with our audiences. This is one of the great things about social media, is being able to get real-time feedback from your audience. And yes, a lot of the times, the comments are not particularly productive, but sometimes they really are. Sometimes... I just was reading a reader comment just before I came in here about some of the photos that we're using to illustrate stories and what those photos kind of signal to them. I had never thought about it that way. And I do think that we need to be humble enough in news leadership, especially right now, humble enough to be listening to voices out there and trying to understand, why aren't we trusted? Why are people tuning into other sources? Again, there are a lot of things that are out of our control, but sometimes you can learn quite a bit if you take the time to listen.
So I think it's a great question. And it's funny, Sam Tannenhouse has this new biography of William F. Buckley out, and Bill was my boss for a while. And I have a lot of disagreements with Tannenhouse about the book, but one of the things I think he's absolutely right about is all these people who said Bill was this great conversationalist. What they actually meant was he was a great listener. And listening is it's a form of showing respect to somebody, of actually hearing what they're trying to say, and working from a place of what Coleridge probably called transcendental empathy, of saying, because there is this. I'm an opinion journalist. I don't do the kind of reporting that Julie does or that my colleague Steve Hayes does, because I like to have arguments, and I cannot stand there and talk to Zorhan Mandami. Go, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. Oh, go on. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say, are you friggin' high? What's wrong with you, right? And we're going to have a fight. And that's how I want to do it. And I know that about myself. So the reporting I've done is sort of send Jonah someplace weird and have him write funny things about it, and that's fine. But the listening thing applies to opinion journalism too, which I still will make the case, if anyone wants to hear it, is in many ways the highest form of journalism. Because it's about making arguments And the best form of opinion journalism, the long-form essay in the New Yorker or the National Review or in the New Republic or anything like that, is very much like what the lawyers do. It's adversarial. And the rule, everyone knows that the prosecutor is biased towards conviction and the defense attorney is biased towards acquittal, but the lawyers have to deal with the facts. And if they don't address the other side's best arguments, they're gonna lose. And that's what I was getting at the beginning about how democracy is about disagreement. And I think really good, even opinion journalists, they listen to what people they disagree with say and work from a certain assumption of good faith. Very few people say, okay, I'm gonna be the villain for all time, right? I mean, maybe Stephen Miller, because I think he's like full of sulfuric ooze or something, but and probably has hooves. But most people don't think they're the villain, and they think that they are in good faith trying to do the right thing. And it's very difficult, particularly for opinion journalists, to understand that the people they disagree with are not demons, and that art of listening is a big part of coming to that realization.
And I was just saying, please stand. You mentioned Mamdani, and part of what people say made his campaign effective was the fact that voters felt heard. They felt like he listened to them, regardless of where you stand on his policies. Go ahead.
So Samantha touched on the history of freedom of the press, and sort of a lot of what we take for granted came out of the 60s. But a lot has happened since then. I sort of feel like there are two different games being played. There's the old, at the risk of sounding binary, the old journalism, which is adhering to these rules. I'd like to hear what people have to say about the free passes that have been given to the new journalism and sort of opinions about Section 230, whether it should be repealed or modified, that will sort of bring the truthiness back to social media, where editors and fact checkers are once again will occupy the field and help that journalism survive.
Well, first, let's start with the definition.
Yeah, so Section 230 of the Telecom Communications Act, right, is this thing that basically, I mean, it says a lot of things, right? And for those of you who don't get into the weeds in this, they should put a big banner above this saying, "This way leads madness," because it gets really complicated and people get very angry and all the rest. But basically it says that platforms are not responsible for the speech of the people on the platform. And as someone who's run websites with comment sections, I very much would not want to be held accountable for some of the things in comment sections and be sued for them. At the same time, I think there's a real problem, right? And how you police it, particularly in the era of AI, where it's going to get even uglier, is a really thorny question. I'll just be honest, I don't know.
Samantha, I'd love to hear you chime in on that.
Yeah, so Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, as you suggest, immunizes platforms and websites when they publish comments from third parties. And so this is an entirely different legal regime that applies to the online world compared to print journalism. If a newspaper publishes a letter to the editor that contains a defamatory statement, the newspaper can be sued for that, even though it didn't originate with the newspaper. But websites are totally immune. And the reason for this, I think there was a lot of optimism about the internet in 1996, that it was going to be this true forum for freedom of expression. And we don't want to get websites kind of caught up in the process of having to use lawyers and vet everything before it appears, because that's going to limit the spontaneity and the interactivity of this new medium. So there was a lot of optimism, and I think we have found that some of that was perhaps unwarranted. And there's been a lot of discussion about repealing Section 230 or modifying it in some way, maybe making Section 230 immunity conditional on websites behaving well, right? That they can lose it if they are engaging in intentional bad acts. And so it's a real question that we have today. But I do believe that if this law were to be changed, there would be a radical transformation of the communication landscape. It would change everything that we're able to access and what we're able to say online.
In the meantime, organizations like the AP have to figure out how to interact with this new media. What kinds of conversations do you have about the presence the AP has online?
Yeah, look, we are as I said, we've been around for 179 years, so we've gone through a lot of technological changes. And so I look at this as just kind of our latest technological change that we're having to work through. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about the places where we need to be, on the internet, on social media platforms. I fundamentally believe if there is a large group of people in a place trying to access information, the AP should be there to provide the kind of fact-based, nonpartisan information that we have produced throughout our history. So that means, yes, we're on TikTok and we're on Instagram and Blue Sky and WhatsApp and name a platform. We're probably there. And we're constantly trying to figure out like the right tone, the right stories, the right way to engage in that conversation. One of the things that I have been really heartened by, I'll get back to the optimistic side, but one of the things I have been really heartened by, particularly over the last couple of months, is I think when we engage in these spaces in authentic ways, when we are transparent and talking about, what went into our reporting, showing our journalists on the ground in really difficult places, the response is generally really positive. Not wholly positive, of course, but it's generally really positive, and I think people see the value. And so that's been one of the things that we've started to explore more. How do we make sure that when we're in these spaces, we're authentic to those platforms and also, again, kind of showing what goes into the work that we're producing?
I would just add there is also a capacity. We'll come here first. I think your question was, but there's always also a capacity question here. Our show had to make the decision to drop Twitter because it was a full-time job to moderate conversations on that platform, and it wasn't a service to our listeners. And so as we decided, okay, how are we going to invest the people resource we have? Do we direct it towards the journalism, or do we direct it to somebody who's going to sit and try to monitor a Twitter conversation that is swiftly devolving? So I think that's also something that news institutions have to take into account. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think you were really getting at the core issue for many people, and that is we've come so far away from what used to be fact-based, and it's all turned into this opinion all the time, and often ill-informed. So, you started talking about maybe solutions, 230, something else, but are there people working on that? It was Walter Cronkite, facts. It was Eric Severide, he'd get a minute or two of opinion, and now we're swamped with all this stuff. And often people are very ill-informed, I think. So what are the solutions, if anything?
So I want to be really clear about something. I think there were a lot of things that were better about the Cronkite era, but I think that a lot of times what people do when they look back with nostalgia at the Cronkite era is they see a kind of manufactured consensus that did have quite a few biases to it. And they work from the assumption that it was purely fact-driven when there was, the CBS Evening News reported that Barry Goldwater was meeting up with neo-Nazi groups in Germany on his vacation. It was a total lie. There were lots of these things that happened in the 1960s. My only point is to say that there was a consensus that was built into mainstream media back then that feels much more reassuring than the chaos now, and there were a lot of things that were better about it. I agree with that entirely. At the same time, one of the reasons why mainstream media was so much more mainstream back then is because the advertising structure of the media environment. If you are selling baby formula to Democrats and Republicans, you got to kind of keep from getting too crazy going one way or the other. One of the problems, and this is the point I was trying to get at with the changes in the structure of media, is that no one gets 30, 40 share ratings anymore. Nobody, right? And so instead, the business model for almost every media outlet, to a certain extent, AP is like one of these last counterexamples, is to not get 30% of the public or 40% of the public, but to get a sticky 4% or 3% of the public. MSNBC has a very narrow but very deep core audience. Fox's is a little broader, but it's the same sort of thing, and it's this pandering. And this is why my question about what kind of media consumers you are. If you're only getting your media from Fox, you're going to come out believing a lot of crazy, stupid stuff. But if you only get your media from MSNBC, you're going to get a lot of crazy, stupid stuff. The best way to sort of check your own priors is to have a diversified portfolio of media that you read, and read widely, and read stuff you agree with and stuff you disagree with, and that'll give you a better sense of where the actual truth lies.
And I would just say, look, I think fact-based journalism exists. There's so much of it out there from big organizations and small organizations, but I do agree with Jonah. I think one thing that has fundamentally changed is honestly, there's a personal responsibility aspect to this. You have to try harder to make sure that the news that you're engaging with, the content you're engaging with, is fact-based, because there are so many forces that are out of our control. I run a large news organization. A lot of this is out of my control. I have to be honest about that. So there is a personal responsibility aspect to this, and I think that we all play a part in that.
Well, unfortunately, that is our time. I know we could probably spend another 3 hours having this discussion, but Julie, Jonah, Samantha, thank you.
Thank you all. Nice job.